And we're live. It is Saturday, May 2nd, 2020, the farthest you will ever be from May Day. Boris Johnson has given his new son a middle name named after two of the doctors who saved him from coronavirus.
That's actually kind of sweet.
Good. That's such good. I had exactly the opposite reaction. I was going to say that's such good spin.
Kim Jong-un has resurfaced, state media says, although no outside media have managed to confirm that he visited a factory on Friday, but they released lots of photographs. And Kate, we have murder hornets.
Yeah, apparently, according to the New York Times, 2-inch long Asian giant hornet species known as the murder hornet was sighted in Washington, and they have arrived again and are back and capable of killing humans. Their venom and stinger make for an excruciating combination that victims have likened to hot metal driving into their skin. And I love true crime, and I kind of like insects, but I really hate this. This sounds awful.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I think like just what we needed. We've had this, we have a plague. We have a plague of locusts, and now we have an invasive murder hornet species. No, you are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Yascha Mounk, who is camped out at the cabin in the woods with baby Cannon. Yascha, welcome to In Lieu of Fun properly this time.
Thank you very much. It's I've been enjoying the cabin. Today the sun is out. Everybody can see the beautiful background here. Thanks for having me.
Yascha, you were like, we got yelled at last Sunday by a very cranky commentator on YouTube who was very upset that we improperly that we squandered our time with you on the show.
Yeah.
And so
today people are gonna get more of me than they've bargained for. So there you go. You're making up for it right now.
To that very cranky commentator, Yascha was an impromptu guest last week, but this week he is the proper guest. So last week we did focus on the actual guest, Sarah Longwell, but today Yascha is here in his own right. So Yascha, I want to start with a question, a comparative political response to COVID-19 question. You are a native of Germany. You went to school in the UK. You live here. You have a house in Italy. How do you understand the leadership and outcome differences between these various countries in terms of COVID-19?
Well, I mean, since you made it biographical, I guess I was born in a place that has had a very functional response. I went to college in a place that had a reasonably dysfunctional response, and now I'm a proud citizen of a country that is screwing up bigly. So I'm a little
you're on the steep decline.
On the bigly decline, yeah. No, look, I mean, I think all governments have failed to some extent. No government was really prepared for what we're facing. Every government was far too slow in responding. That was true in Germany as well. I remember having a Twitter exchange, also colloquially known as a shouting match, with a German government minister in early March who was saying, "We've only just had the first death from corona. This is all not so bad. It's kind of like the flu. Why are you guys worried?" That's a German government minister who's not from an extremist party, who's not, a populist or anything like that, but who clearly did not understand the stakes even at a very late stage. So the German government was late in responding. But once they understood what the stakes were, they've had sensible political leadership. Angela Merkel is a unifier by instinct. She tries to unify the country. She's been very sensible in her response to it. The country has managed to ramp up its testing very quickly, so we actually have a much better sense of what's going on. and is now at a stage where we're really on the downward trend of the disease, and we can they can start to open up the economy, open up schools to some extent. There are fears that will shoot back up to R0 being over 1, which is to say to the incidence of a disease spreading again. So I don't think that the situation is by any means solved in Germany, but it is much, much better than 2 other countries. So second country you asked about, I mean, I know you always start with Boris Johnson, so you all know about that. Boris Johnson was in a hospital in the beginning of March shaking hands with COVID-19 patients. He was consistently downplaying the seriousness of the disease. By the way, a popular talking point on the left of the United States is that the US is dealing particularly badly with this because of our healthcare system. I think there's some merits to that claim, but of course the single payer system in Britain has not performed very well at all either. It has very limited capacity, and the death rates for people have been shockingly high. So Britain has been more sensible than the United States, less erratic than the United States. I believe at this point a significantly lower death toll per capita than the United States. I'm not entirely sure on that, but it has been far from good. And then the United States, of course, we should be able to master this very, very well. When my university, Johns Hopkins, did a study of the preparedness of global health systems a couple of years ago, they put the United States right on top because we have excellent scientists, we have a lot of state capacity, we have a lot of hospitals, we have a lot of ICU beds. But frankly, the federal government has, veered in its response in a crazy way and essentially given up on putting in place the kind of test, trace, and quarantine regime that we need in order to get out of this in a sensible way. And so, I'm despairing about what's going on in the States right now.
When you say you're despairing, one of the weird things about the States relative to all other countries, save Canada, is the relatively high degree to which states will be very different from one another. And I don't have the impression that Saxony and, Bavaria are implementing, despite the sort of formalism of the German Federated Republic, I don't have the impression that, in fact, those decisions are being made at the state level. But the difference between, Arkansas and California is immense. And so I'm interested for your thoughts on sort of comparative European versus American federalism here. Is the right comparison between the United States and Germany, or is the right comparison between the United States and the EU? And then you have as much, diversity within the EU as, that actually describes something like the diversity of response within the United States, with the important proviso, of course, that Donald Trump has no analog in the EU.
Right. Well, let me think through this. I mean, first of all, it's true that the United States is actually a much more federal country than Germany. And Germans think of themselves as a very federal country, and when they hear that the United States is a federal country, and they think it's similar. But they vastly underestimate the extent of political difference you have between US states. So the idea that most people who are in jail have been sentenced according to state criminal laws, the idea that you have a death penalty in some US states but not in other US states, is very, very alien to Germans and to Europeans more broadly. No European country has that amount of decentralized power. The same about the welfare state. I mean, Massachusetts has a welfare state that's actually substantially similar to European countries in many ways. Mississippi has a much, much, much less substantial welfare state. That's not something that Europeans sort of instinctively understand. It's much more extreme than what we have, certainly in Germany. So I think when it comes to the current differences in terms of how people deal with that, you might put it down to that, but it's a little bit more complicated, because when it comes to public health measures, the relevant decision makers in Germany are local and state level as well. So for a while there was, a football match that was going to be played in Berlin, and the chancellor implored the government of Berlin to cancel it, but it was not in her gift to cancel it. She had to rely on the mayor of Berlin in order to do that. So there is sort of the same coordination problem. The difference is that after a week or two of chaos at the beginning, Germany has managed to coordinate because it has a more consensual political culture and frankly, because it has a more competent government. What we're seeing in the United States is just a complete lack of that coordination and a lack of the federal government at trying to lead the country. I think if Donald Trump was a very different kind of president, and if he made it very clear what he thinks states should do and try to do that in a way that bridges partisanship, you might have gotten a much more consistent set of actions from different US states. Now, my fear is, here's the reason why the analogy to the EU doesn't hold, which is that for all of the power of the EU, nation states are way more powerful than the European Union. They have more financial resources, they have the public health authorities, they have the army, they have all of the kinds of things you need in order to actually have a sensible response. So even for this huge variety between different nation states, and the EU is sort of kind of coordinating but not doing much, and you might think that's kind of similar to the federal government versus the US states. The point is that individual European nations are capable of policing the borders and deploying the resources to build their own test and trace regimes. I'm very skeptical that US states can do the same thing. They certainly can't stop people from other states coming in. So even if they manage to build an effective regime and they control the virus, you can have visitors coming in every day who re-import the virus. And I just don't think that, even Massachusetts or New York State has the money, the resources, the trust in the population, the ability to reach its citizens to, for example, get near universal buy-in to an app that would inform people if somebody they've been in contact with has COVID-19.
So can I kind of break in just for a second, which is, I just kind of want to make the point that I feel like this is kind of like doubling down on what we heard from Seth yesterday, which was kind of just like how different he's coming from like tiny state of Rhode Island, and he's the general treasurer, and he kind of came on and talked about state budgets and was just talking about like the way that the federal system is kind of playing out in terms of bargaining for PPE, in terms of bargaining for various types of for ventilators, and like kind of just pitting people against these like entities against each other. I'm skeptical just because of scale and like just the socialization of the country and the culture of the country, that like, of course, I don't even think it's a fair comparison to compare Germany to the United States. Like the scale is just enormous. It's just like you have different, not just like from a federalist perspective, but like, as Ben said, Arkansas is not California, is not New York, is not Alaska. Like they're just such different places. Here's the other thing I kind of want to raise, which I feel like people do not talk about often enough when they talk about state governments, which is like, for example, Cuomo just said like officially close K through 12 schools for the rest of the year, right? And like, I'm from upstate Western New York, and they've had very, 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 very few cases. And I would imagine that his decision statewide to close all of the schools is based around New York City. And it's really kind of this very interesting moment of which we've always had this moment, which is like the town versus country, like town and the country. But like state governors having a really hard time pleasing both, like saying the right things for the electorate in the country and the right things for the electorate in the city. But now it's like the policy changes are just absolutely structurally different. I just kind of wonder, what do you think that this means for federalism coming out of all of this? I've been trying to kind of play with this idea for a while since all of this started. I just think it's revealed so many tensions between the idea of a federal government versus individual state governments versus them all being kind of beholden to, the decentralization is just super interesting. So I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, well, a couple of words. The first is that I think, I'm less worried about people making slightly different decisions around whether to have schools open or, for example, whether you should have a mask. I mean, now I'm in rural Virginia, people wearing masks is sort of irrelevant because, like you just don't encounter people that closely. And you can really just be out and about, and the likelihood of being within 6 feet of somebody is very, very low. That's obviously very different when you're talking about New York City or even Central Park. The same may be true that, whether or not schools should be open depends a lot on the local infection rates, and they're going to vary hugely between Alaska and Arkansas and New York State. I think that's absolutely right. What I do worry about is that, every country which is managing to reopen life and the economy to some extent at the moment, and there's now a good number of countries that are doing that without a huge resurgence of cases, and we'll see how long they can sustain that, has some kind of national system in place to make sure that we drive up testing, to make sure that we trace people who've been exposed to this, to make sure that people are quarantined. And the complete abdication of the federal government in its responsibility to do that, I think it's crazy. And I don't think on like a sensible test, trace, and quarantine regime, the sort of differences in lifestyle between Alaska and Arkansas and New York are as relevant as they are on questions about, do you have to wear a mask and should the local schools open? Now, in terms of sort of federalism generally, look, I'm a little cynical about this. I think that sort of like Supreme Court activism, it is a very, very partisan issue that doesn't flip moment to moment, but it flips over sort of decades. So, liberals for a very long time loved the idea of an activist Supreme Court because a lot of the politics wasn't very liberal, and the Supreme Court tended to have liberal majorities.
Well, it gave us Roe v. Wade. It gave us Brown versus Board of Education.
It gave us very important things. But now suddenly liberals are starting to say, well, an activist Supreme Court is really terrible, and that's the worst kind of thing. It's an affront to democracy. Because right now it's giving us Citizens United and all kinds of decisions that are going on the other side because it's dominated by conservatives. I think there's something similar with federalism. Now, obviously, given the history of the Civil War and so on, there's something slightly more hardwired about the sort of right-wing sympathy and attraction towards federalism and the left-wing skepticism of it. But I do think that we might see that start to flip as there, a number of very populous states that have very robustly democratic control, or control by the Democratic Party on the one hand, but a Senate that will probably continue to be dominated by Republicans for a good long while. You're going to start to see liberals becoming more and more attracted to federalism. But I don't think the underlying mix of advantages and disadvantages has changed a lot. I think, there's always been some real advantages to federalism, but also real limits as to what you can delegate to the states, and a real need for an energetic central government.
I just want to say, in the current environment, federalism is the only thing we got going for us right now. I mean, can you imagine?
Can you
imagine what this situation would look like if we did not have the counterweight against the federal government of Mike DeWine and Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo and Gretchen Whitmer? And I think that the case study that we have going on right now in how federalism is a accountability mechanism for national power is super powerful. And every day I wake up and I think, thank God. And I live in the place that's the least federalist in the United States, Washington, D.C., right, where we are subject to plenary congressional control and home rule to the extent they let us have it, which is to say functionally quite a lot. And every day I wake up subject to the rule of a sane government rather than to the rule of the White House, which I can walk to. And that is a miraculous thing.
I mean, look, given that the president is Donald Trump, obviously right now, the more federalism, the better. I do think that's a slightly short-termist way of thinking about it. I think.
Can we also just say I've always been so confused by the term federalism because like it sounds like in my mind, like I know it's a federation like of like states, but it always like federal, the feds always meant the national government. And
It
so I've
means the
always just
opposite
like,
in
and
Canada.
it means yeah, and it's like the most confusing term. And like I actually am kind of like, maybe like when we say about like this is like so good for federalism, but like what is the point of having like what is the federal government, what is the national government given us lately is I guess kind of also like how I'm feeling coming out of this. I just don't know how.
Give us Obamacare and drone strikes.
Yeah, well, right. But that's great. Thank you, Ben.
Killed a lot of terrorists. All right. Speaking of Canada, I want to introduce and get introduced to a very cool person who is joining us, I believe, though I'm not sure, from Montreal. And Pauline Brock is probably our most faithful viewer. She is on every day on In Lieu of Fun. This is the first time she has ever posed a question. And so I want to ask Pauline Brock, who the heck are you?
Am I muted or unmuted?
You're unmuted. We hear you loud and clear.
Oh, I'm okay. I'm just a grandmother in Montreal. I'm addicted to the internet. I'm addicted to politics, and that's it.
Excellent. And are you I take from your question that you're Jewish. So are you part of that legendary Montreal Jewish Anglo community that's pre-76?
Yeah, I guess so. Although I don't really have much in common with them.
I just answered on the census, Pauline, all of my extended relatives, I don't even know if this counts, but all I know about my extended relatives on my maternal grandfather's side, they all came from French Canada, which I what I think explains a little bit of my weirdness. And I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, we have very distinctive politics here, but generally I like the French people, the French Canadians. Most of my contemporaries would probably disagree with that, but I find them to be very, in day-to-day personal encounters, they're very civilized. They're very nice, friendly people. They're not weird at all. Except, well, for their politics, but that's something else.
So what's your question?
My question has to do with Jews and how a Jewish person can be racist, can not want immigration like Stephen Miller, can come out with things saying, oh, this isn't the country I grew up in, and it's all the populist stuff. How can a Jewish person who grew up like under the shadow of the Holocaust, and that's exactly how we got that thing, how can a Jewish person hold these views? I've never understood that. And Yascha was the only one who was able to explain to me about the Irish backstop. So I'm hoping he can work some magic with this too.
I've forgotten everything about the Irish backstop, so don't ask me to explain that again.
Was from one of your podcasts. I never understood it until I listened to that.
Yeah,
gotcha.
I mean, it's
thanks for speaking up finally, and do it again soon.
Okay.
So Yascha, like, what is this? Like, I think like Pauline's question gets to something deep, which is if there was one community that was consistently opposed to authoritarian populism historically, it is the Jewish community. And now we have, the Likud party in Israel has sort of gone all in for it. The Orthodox community in the United States is pretty Trumpy, although in a very transactional sort of way. And the broader Jewish community's outrage about Hungary and Poland is not quite what you would expect it to be. And so I'm interested in your, you're the great theoretician of democratic deconsolidation. What's going on with the Jews?
Well, let me take a very long run up to this, which is that first of all, I think I recognize Pauline from my Twitter feed. I posed a question this morning. I was doing a TV hit in Britain on the sort of main evening news, and my hair is sort of quarantine chaotic. My hair is always chaotic, but it was particularly chaotic today. And I was wondering, should I shave it all off? Should I, should I try and have a sensible haircut, or do I just own the crazy? And I believe it was Pauline who wrote under that poll, which, by the way, was heavily for Own the Crazy. So this is now part of my brand. There you go. She said it would break her heart if I shaved off the hair, which swayed me. So I did not expect to be united with Pauline here in lieu of fun. But and that was an excellent question. So look, I mean, the first thing to say, slightly in defense of the Jews, is that Jews have always been heavily democratic voting in the United States, and they continue to be as heavily democratic voting now as they have been in the past. There's always this question about whether Jews are going to start voting more Republican, in part because they do better socioeconomically than the middle of a population, in part because there are some obvious tensions between different parts of a democratic coalition. So Muslims are heavily democratic, Jews are heavily democratic for obvious reasons. There are some conflicts between Jews and Muslims, even in this country. And so there's always this question of whether Jews are going to start voting on the right. And that hasn't happened, right? I mean, Jews continue to be, I think with like some exceptions of very small religious groups, the most overwhelming democratic religious group in the United States. And so this is not true of most Jews. Now, of course, Jews are heavily represented in the Trumpist movement as well. It's partially because they do quite well in general, and so they're very heavily represented in the anti-Trump movement. They're also heavily represented in the Trump movement. They're very heavily overrepresented, by the way, in the people who were on the Republican side, on the conservative side, but who couldn't stomach Trump. So if you think of some of the bravest voices that have spoken up over the last years that you could have expected to be on Trump's side, but who've actually taken a very principled line, there's been a lot of Jews among them. But Pauline is absolutely right. There are people, including obviously Steve Miller and many others, who are going right along with a Trumpist project. And I think the answer to that is very, very simple, which is that every community, every religious group, every ethnicity, every culture is capable of racial and religious hatred. I think right now in the United States, there are people who want to emphasize the structural nature of racism. And I think there is a structural element to racism, but we want to say racism is exclusively structural. And therefore, the only people who can be racist are whites, and they can only be racist towards non-whites. I think that unfortunately is too simplistic a view of a world. There are many immigrants who are deeply racist. There are many immigrants who are themselves people of color who are deeply racist against other groups of color. There are African Americans, by the way, who are racist against Jews, as we've seen with some of the attacks in New York City. And despite the long history of suffering, sadly, there are many Jews who are capable of the same bigoted, ignorant, racial and religious hatred as any other group in the world. I see that, Ben, you're rerunning my poll here.
I think this is not, this is a much better sample than your Twitter feed, because like there are no retweets or anything. This is actually a sample of people who care enough about you to join a Zoom conference with you. So I think it's a special. And I just want to point out that screw it, it's a pandemic, let it grow is really winning overwhelmingly at this point. There was no, I just want to emphasize there was no bias in the formulation of the question or answers here. Are you still there?
I'm still there. Yeah, I finished my point, but we can, I can go on, or we can discuss my hair.
All right. So far, we have 100% consensus on within 1 minute on, like, we still have 5 or 6 people who haven't voted. So if you haven't voted on Yascha's hair, you still have a chance here.
Let me share one of the deep frustrations. I mean, I'm sort of assuming that nobody, that it's not going to be on the internet forever, which it is going to be, I know, so never mind. But one of the deep injustices of being a balding man is that you have a simultaneous problem of too little hair and too much hair. There's too little hair for you not to look bald, but the more hair you have and the longer it is, the more bald you look. It's really just, Alanis Morissette should write a song about it.
I just want to point out that as somebody who is not balding, but who has grayed very quickly, and I think you can probably see this at this hour, my left eyebrow, which is showing up on your right,
Oh yeah, it's like a little streak.
is mostly gray. My right eyebrow has not grayed at all. My hair is mostly gray. So I am hoping to have one wholly gray eyebrow and one wholly brown eyebrow. I think that would be very striking looking.
That would look pretty good.
Yeah, just saying.
You can always do it artificially. Gerhard Schröder, who I'm going to say for legal safety, did not dye his hair ever. At some point while he was Chancellor of Germany, sued various journalists and private individuals, I believe as well, for claiming that he had dyed his hair. So you can choose not to emulate Gerhard Schröder and dye one of your eyebrows brown if you want to do that.
All right, I'm getting a whole bunch of people challenging my claim that I am not balding here, from
That's so rude.
From Ted Gilchrist to Nicole Goldberg. So I want to say I keep my hair very short. My hairline has receded a little bit over the last few years, but if I actually let my hair grow, there's plenty of hair. I'm be fine with balding. In fact, I actually keep my hair cropped so short that people like you think I'm balding, but I've got a fair bit of hair. So yeah, there's a little bit of receding going on, not shy about it. I can even measure it because there's one hair. Thank you, Nicole. There's plenty of hair to do a comb over, but I am confident enough in my hairline that I don't do that, you see? Anyway, all right. Meanwhile, enough about hair, guys. Let's ask Yascha some questions about democratic deconsolidation. So Yascha, you are the great theoretician of democratic deconsolidation. You were arguing for it when it was an eccentric theory that you were, I remember when I first heard of you, it was like in the context of, is Yascha Mounk, does he really believe that? Or is he just trying to make a splash in his dissertation, right? That was the way people talked about democratic deconsolidation. Now everybody believes in democratic deconsolidation. And last weekend, when we were sitting in the cabin together, you were saying, I actually feel pretty good about the chances of unseating Donald Trump. And that is not, broadly speaking, what one would predict from the theoretician of democratic deconsolidation. So I want to break some news here. Is Yascha Mounk optimistic about democracy in the United States?
Well, so the first thing, I guess, this maybe sort of, I don't think I'm a pessimist. I'm actually a very upbeat and happy person, and I'm not the sort of, I tend to prefer not to worry about problems. My only fights with my mom are about the fact that she sees all the potential problems 7 years in the future about everything, and I think it's going to be fine, and if a problem arises, we'll solve it then. So I never see myself as a pessimist. I think, though, that there's a tendency in life to think that if something has been the case for a long time, it'll always be the case, a status quo bias. And there's also a tendency to think that, if something seems unsustainable, but it's been sustained, then I guess we're wrong about it being unsustainable, and it'll keep going on like that. And I think the sort of couple of moments in my life when I've really been out ahead of other people are because I don't share those instincts. So, I was seeing all of these warning signs about democracy around the world, including deep dissatisfaction with both particular governments and the democratic system as a whole in opinion polls, including fewer and fewer people going out to vote in many countries, including growing support for extremist parties, all kinds of warning signs. And everybody said, it's going to be fine. And after, well, what if it's not? What if we actually take those warning signs seriously? And that's how I came on to sort of the idea of democratic deconsolidation earlier than others. I mean, in a similar way, I think I was out a little bit ahead, not that much ahead, but a little bit ahead of other people in taking COVID-19 very seriously, and read that article about canceling everything. Again, because I think there was just a bias of people saying, there's been past diseases and they've all gone away. And all of my life, things have been normal. There's never been a pandemic period where we suddenly have to, socially distance and find refuge in various lovely cabins. So this can't happen this time either. And I was just looking at the facts. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an expert on this, but I was looking at the rate of growth around the world and thinking, well, why should the US be any different than these other countries? So I'm not a pessimist, actually. And when it comes to populism, I think people are very tempted by it. I think it is a powerful rhetorical tool that'll stay with us. But I also think that when people are actually exposed to populist governments for long enough, and particularly when all of the abstract warnings that people like me make about it, saying that it's going to really impact the lives of ordinary people if we have a government that doesn't respect experts, that captures independent institutions, that politicizes everything, that's incompetent. Once those warnings really hit home and people see them in their own daily lives, as unfortunately, tragically, they are right now in the context of the coronavirus, I think they'll get sick of it. And I think they'll say, I've had enough of it. The question is whether at that point, they're still capable of voting out the government, or whether, as in Hungary and in Venezuela and in other countries, the populist leaders have taken on enough power that the elections are no longer even remotely free and fair. I think in the United States, we are reaching the point where people really want to get rid of Donald Trump. I think he's never been as popular as some people think. And I think at this point, people really want a unifier, really want somebody who'd run a competent administration. And so I worry about the fairness of the elections that we have coming up. I think that they're clearly going to be sufficiently free and fair that if Democrats win a huge landslide victory, Donald Trump will duly leave the White House. And I think the chances of that are higher right now than they've been at any point in the last 3 or 4 years.
I hope you're right.
I'm not saying, by the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying this is guaranteed at all. It's absolutely possible that Donald Trump will win. But I think that the reasons for hope are higher than they've been in the last 3 or 4 years. Sorry.
And how do you assess the person of Joe Biden in that regard? I mean, I can argue this both ways, right? Which is to unseat a charismatic incumbent, you actually need a charismatic challenger. I could also argue, and I think I may believe, that actually the sort of Warren Harding return to normalcy, boring front porch campaign in which Joe Biden says as little as possible and functions basically as a representative of the generic Democrat in the polling. He doesn't have to be inspiring. He doesn't have to be smart. He doesn't even have to be. He certainly doesn't have to be rhetorically clever. He doesn't have to have a vision except not Trump, and kind of back to normal, is actually somewhere close to ideal in terms of what people want. And so if you were thinking of the prototypical, the sort of perfect way to run against the declining popularity authoritarian populist at the point at which he's, you still have the democratic institutions to do it, but he's not, but he's past he's ebbing in the excitement that he induces, and people are kind of getting the message. Which do you prefer? Do you prefer a figure that's exciting in his own right, or is the basic message the return to a status quo ante that was decent and reasonable?
Look, I mean, if I could, run Barack Obama 2008, over and over in every election in every country, I would, but the problem with Barack Obama in 2008 is, as one statesman I know puts it, but he's a non-transferable asset. It's just, you just cannot emulate Barack Obama. He's a once in a generation political talent who is capable of uniting inspiration with moderation, mobilizing his base with reaching people who are often quite hostile to
Isn't
Democrats.
that a problem with politics and not the non-transferability of Barack Obama? Like, isn't it a problem that we look for, like, that, like, our perfect candidate is a Barack Obama, and not that our perfect candidate, like, not that we can, like, I don't know. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just kind of I'm like listening, and I'm just kind of like, but it's not fair. It's not fair that we have to, like, the Democrats, and, like, to be fair, I remember so vividly the 2004 convention where he gave the DNC convention's, like, keynote. And my friend at the time, who was a Dem, I'm not going to say operative anymore, but like a Dem worker. And he was like, this person will never be elected ever. His middle name is Hussein. This person will never be elected. He's Black. To and this was like a super liberal. And I was like, no, that is the mix. What he's got is the mix that he's like got the Kennedy thing. He's got it. Like, everyone who's like, he has this gene, but like, that's not what we actually, like, why should everyone have to have a special magic power for, like, consolidating people through stump speeches? I just don't feel like that's actually a very good, like, a very, like, very good, like, a very ultimately very, like, transferable talent to the what actually it takes to be president, for example.
Look, I agree with that. But that's the nature of democratic politics. I mean, you got to be able to reach people, and you got to be able to inspire people. And you got to be able to build that coalition. There's different ways of doing that, but, you know, incredible charisma, as Barack Obama had, paired with very shrewd strategic choices, we should say, is one way of doing that. But actually, you know, in a way, though, is the long way around to the answer to Ben's question, which is that I think Joe Biden may be capable of actually, I'm going to be super optimistic here for a moment, winning a bigger landslide victory than Barack Obama in 2008. And the reason is that he has some advantages of his own in this particular moment. You know, I thought for a long time that if somebody could run in 2020, sorry, and I've been arguing this for 2 or 3 years at this point, on the promise that, you know, you vote for me, and you can go back on a Monday night to go into a bar and drinking with your buddies, and you can talk about football rather than about the president of the United States, you have my vote. I think,
so the candidate who actually ran on something like that was Michael Bennet from Colorado, who made the campaign promise, if you elect me, I promise you won't have to think about the president for 2 weeks at a time. And I thought that was the most awesomely excellent campaign promise.
So good.
And it
so
achieved
great.
I may or may not have talked to him at some point.
That's hilarious. I love that. I mean, it's just like, it's
but look, it's hard to break through for you know, a moderate candidate with middling name recognition. I like Michael Bennet very, very much. It's not a surprise to me that he wasn't able to break through ultimately. But the point about Joe Biden is, you know, we could all sort of wish for things and so on and so forth. I think that Joe Biden can deliver that promise. I think that most people, you know, around here, Ben, which is clearly Trump country, you see, you know, Trump signs everywhere. I'm not saying that Joe Biden is going to have a huge amount of a vote here, but I think people can look at Joe Biden and say, you know what, I don't like him, I don't agree with him, but he doesn't scare me. You know, I think my country is going to be just fine if he becomes president. And I think, by the way, that's probably going to demobilize some of the people around here who are less politically inclined, and who are not scared of somebody like Joe Biden. I think it's even more important for the many people that Sarah Longwell was talking about, who are educated Republican women in the suburbs, some working class Republican women, who see all the things that are wrong with Donald Trump, who don't want our country to be as divided and as nasty as it is right now, who are going to be really angry come November about our failure, unfortunately, it looks like, to deal with the coronavirus sensibly. And I think it'll matter that somebody like Joe Biden doesn't scare them, but they look at Joe Biden and they look at the team he's going to put together, hopefully, and say, you know what, that guy's going to be competent. He knows how to govern. He's been a vice president for 8 years very well. He's been a senator for a long time.
I wish he'd gotten
And
elected.
he doesn't hate me. He respects me. So
yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I mean, the reference to the vote in Shenandoah County, Virginia, is interesting because I think it's been a while since I looked at the 2016 data from Shenandoah, but I believe it was around 70% for Trump, 30% for Hillary. Joe Biden is not going to win Shenandoah County, Virginia, but you could imagine him getting 35% of the vote in Shenandoah County. You could imagine there being fewer votes in absolute terms for Donald Trump in Shenandoah than there were. And there are certainly fewer Trump-Pence yard signs today than there were 4 years ago as I drive around the area near the cabin.
Is it just me, or is like Pence, I know everyone talks about this, and this is something that came up a lot in impeachment, but like Pence fucking terrifies me, like in a way that like at least I kind of can understand the impulses and like motivations of like Trump, and they seem completely narcissistic and everything else, and like all of the DSM-5 and everything else. But like Pence and his like calling his wife by mother is like this hearkening back to this era that I thought was mostly dead and we'd stomped on, and it was dead. And like, he kind of, it's like, I mean, and this is coming up from I grew up as a Republican conservative. Like, I understood that these things existed. I cannot, like, some of the stuff that he does, I'm just like, it's really scary to me. Is no one else as scared of him as I am? Also, he can talk.
Yeah, I'm not. I have to say. I mean, look, I'm a European secular Jew. You know, religion is not in my blood. And Jürgen Habermas once said he's religiously unmusical. That's certainly true of me. So understanding something like Mike Pence doesn't come naturally to me. It's a very different milieu. Having said that, I think there's two reasons why it doesn't scare me particularly. The first is that I've always found, the huge popularity of A Handmaid's Tale to be very strange. I mean, it's a wonderful novel and it's a great TV show, but
it's not that wonderful a novel. Sorry, it's just like not that well written. Like I don't love it. I think I know I'm going to get like hate mail for this as a feminist, but I'm like, meh. Like, this is also how I feel about Hunger Games.
Right. So opinions about Margaret Atwood aside, we'll leave it aside. But it's just the idea that that's where the United States is headed was always absurd to me. I mean, the United States is not a Ned Flanders kind of country. Ned Flanders is in the United States, but the United States is not going to be that. And I can see how perhaps in, the first term of George W. Bush, that, you could have had that fear as liberals and so on. I think today I just don't buy that. And that's not what's true around here either, right? I mean, when you are in Trump country and so on, people aren't, they're religious, a lot of them, and they have very different values from, progressives on college campuses. But the idea that what they actually want is a kind of Handmaid's Tale kind of world is just, I don't buy it for one moment. And then I have to say that I prefer somebody, and Mike Pence obviously has been deeply complicit with Trump, so I'm not exactly talking about him, but I prefer somebody whose religious convictions are very different from mine, who's much more conservative about important social issues than mine, even somebody who doesn't share my conceptions of what some fundamental rights are, as long as they respect the political system, and as long as they don't try to concentrate power in their own hands, as long as they have some reverence for the US Constitution. And the reason is not that the things they do might be less bad in the short run. The reason is that assures me of my ability to argue against them and mobilize against them and vote them out at the next election and make sure that to the extent possible, we undo some of those damages. And in that sense, the evangelical Christian far-right, sort of socially far-right parts of the Republican Party don't scare me nearly in the kind of way that the national populist parts of it do.
I completely agree with Yascha. I feel like Mike Pence is a species of conservative that has existed my entire life in roughly the same proportion, and it's not something that it's like something I feel like I grew up with under the Reagan administration with the moral majority folks, and you know, it was the Tom DeLay faction of which Mike Pence was a part. It's just been this kind of constant stream of American religious right conservatism.
Since
And I
Falwell?
don't, yeah, it's a very consistent stream of American political life. It's one that I have almost no sympathy for, but I'm also I don't feel like is new or threatening in a novel way. Whereas I think its deal with Trumpism is profoundly new and different from anything I've ever seen before, and much scarier.
Could I just,
So,
I just want to address 2 points that people made in the questions, because I want to acknowledge them. The first, that somebody is saying that US deaths per million so far under 200, in the UK is over 400. I haven't looked that up myself, but if that's right, then I was certainly wrong about the comparative death rates earlier. And the other is that I want to qualify, somebody's making the right point, that the question whether a couple million dead bodies are a reasonable price to pay for setting aside a populist government. I think that's exactly right. I mean, you know, my biggest motivation over the last few years has been to make sure that we resist populist governments, and that we make sure that somebody like Donald Trump doesn't have a chance to do even deeper damage to our system of government here in the United States, which has to entail getting him out of the White House in the fall of 2020. But a lot of the reason for that was that I really feared the kind of terrible impact he could have on the lives of ordinary people. And right now in this pandemic, we are seeing an existential moment in which literally our decisions will determine whether hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions live or die. So I am hoping to the bottom of my heart that the federal government manages to mount an effective
did we lose?
We did.
will
It
fail to
flipped
do
out
that.
for a
And so
second.
as I'm deeply pessimistic about the US managing to avoid unnecessary deaths, I'm optimistic, quote unquote, about the ability to get Trump out of the White House. But I'd much rather that we have an effective response to the pandemic, without a doubt.
All right. We lost you for a couple seconds there, Yascha. But I think we got the gist of that. We need to use the last few minutes of the show to plan this week's show. So you are more than welcome to hang around for that and plan the show with us if you like. Or if you prefer to drop off and wander off into the woods, you're of course welcome to do that as well.
I want to see how you're planning your show, so I'll leave you to that and
okay.
hang out.
So
Yeah.
Kate, what are we doing this week? We had Pugilism Week, and then we had our star-studded week culminating with Yascha's presence. What are we doing this week?
Well, I have a bunch of people. I lost my sheet. It's like over my notebook I left in the other room, but then I keep track of everything. But I was thinking that because this is a big week for social media, in particular the oversight board for Facebook, that it would be fun to kind of check in with journalists, with media, with kind of people in communications, and kind of do something on that. Emily Bell, who is the director of the Tao Center of Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School, would love to be on. She says our podcast is the cool kids podcast of the COVID crisis. So I'm that.
Well, anybody who says that,
she sold me on
gets
that.
you an invitation. Yeah.
Suck up.
I know, right?
I'm straight.
So
nobody who says I'm going bald, by the way, gets on the show. Nicole Goldberg.
Wait, so if I call you bald, I don't have to come back on?
No, because I'll know you're faking it. Just to spite Nicole Goldberg, I may grow out my hair.
That's very bold. I mean, well, we'll see. I have to do a little thinking. I kind of wanted to run this by you, but in our tradition of not talking about stuff kind of off screen, I didn't do a lot of planning specifically because I wanted to see what you thought. So if you're kind of cool with that, then we can talk about it as the show evolves. But I'd love to start with Emily on Monday. I have a few other people. John Chernin, who is a friend of mine also from college, and is a writer and editor in Hollywood. He has written for oh my God, Sunny Philadelphia. What is the, oh my God, I'm really screwing it up. What is this show? Always Sunny in Philadelphia. He wrote that. He was like one of the writers on the show. He was a writer on Deadwood. He's really great. I'm just kind of fascinated to know what is happening to all of the content that people are so thirsty for because they're trapped at home. But at the same time, you cannot actually have like movie sets and things like that. So like a lot of things have been canceled. So I'd kind of like to have John on one of these days.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
I also think we should have, so we have a request from Allison to bring Nicole Turner-Lee on. She's one of my Brookings colleagues who was on the Lawfare podcast yesterday, I believe, talking about 5G. I can shoot Nicole a note along with her co-author on the piece they were talking about. They were writing a piece about, they wrote a paper about 5G rollout and did a very interesting podcast, which we could follow up with them or with Nicole alone about.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then I was also thinking that like for Wednesday, which may or may not be a big day that I'm not allowed to talk about technically, that we could have Nicole Wong, former counsel for YouTube and Google, and Alexander McElvray, who is the former general counsel for Twitter, on the show together. They're friends. We've all been at like dinner together. They're wonderful people. And I would just love to hear on Wednesday what they're thinking about kind of the forward thinking, what the news has like tipped them towards on like thinking about the forward thinking.
Which news is that, Kate?
I can't say technically, Ben, I got yelled at already. But like, anyways, so like Nicole, so like, that sounds great. We've got Emily, Nicole, and John, and then like and then like we can mix those up at some point and like put in your Nicole. And then, yeah.
And then there's Nicole Goldberg, who keeps like talking about my hair.
I'm like,
we're very heavy on Nicole's right now.
We're very heavy on Nicole's. Is that like an 80s name? What are the name? I feel like there were 80s names. Like, and then there were like, I swear to God, I'm like starting to work with all of these women who like, I am certain that I would have babysat them at some point because they're all named like Mackenzie and Kendall and Ford and like all of these types of like names. And I'm just like, those aren't names. Those are like proper nouns. Like,
yeah. and also like there was a period of naming girls when the sound of the name could easily be misinterpreted as farm equipment. You know, like I drove my Mackenzie out into the field. And,
oh, that's a really good. I love that. What about what about the age of Rebecca's and Barbara's? Like, there's no more of those anymore.
Right. Like we only do like heavy lifting machinery now.
My mom.
They're also different by country. I feel like when I was in college in Britain, everybody was a Rebecca, whereas I think Rebecca's here somehow of a different generation. There's not as many Rebeccas I can think of.
No, like I have a bunch of Rebeccas, tons of them that I grew up with. Nobody's naming their kids Rebecca. I know 6 people who just named their son August.
Also Hannah, when like a half generation ago, all women were named Hannah.
And Phoebe and Sophia.
And now
Olivia.
No women are named Hannah.
Yeah. Now it's all. Yeah.
But before we recreate the whole, can I recommend 2 guests?
Yeah.
So one is Juliette Kayyem, who I don't know personally, but we were on a panel together. I think Ben, you were probably there.
I know Juliette.
Yeah, I think she's excellent.
Yeah.
So she'll be good. And then my friend Sam Kappelman, who's the most talented 23-year-old in the world, or perhaps he's 24 now or something ridiculous, has been doing a podcast, a newsletter that's quite successful called Cooking in Quarantine, where he both interviews a bunch of chefs, but also sort of shares his own cooking experiments. So
Can
you
you
could
give
have
me some tips on cutting things?
Yeah, I think we're gonna do that.
I think he could, but it appears to be too late.
Recipes and safety tips for Kate.
I bought a chainmail glove, Ben. I bought a chainmail glove. After this, I bought it.
Excellent.
I bought one.
Kevlar. Go Kevlar for you. All right. I think that gives us some stuff to go on. So some people that I need to get on this week, Shane, for those of you who've been agitating for Shane, Shane will come on. And also, for those of you who enjoyed my Twitter smackdown with Dan Bongino, I am going to invite him on Twitter to join us on the show. I don't think he'll show up, but you know, I was so moved by his concern for my reputation, and you know, he suggested that I change my name to spare my family more agony.
What the fuck is that about? That was so
I don't know.
weird.
It was really
so
weird.
Also, EJ did such a good job. I just was like, wow, he is so compelling. Like, I was just like, it was like he was so sweet and just kind of like, you're an idiot. Please stop. I'm so happy without you in my life.
But on the off chance that Dan Bongino wants to join us on In Lieu of Fun, we will of course be more than happy to host him, and maybe EJ will join us too. I
have a sign off.
You have a sign off? Go for it.
I am rethinking it, but I do think it might still be, I think it's even more my mantra than it's ever been before. But in light of COVID-19, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. It's like I
Breathe
think our
on
mantra
them.
for today.
Yeah, it's nice.
But like I say this
also, you know, treat every day as though it were your last, and one day you'll be right.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Whoa, that's a good. You're not allowed to outdo me with mantras. You already do the intro, but also your intro is way better than my intro would be. I appreciate you just like taking that over.
No, you should take it over anytime.
Oh, I don't want to do the intro. Like
but are you gonna add every day a little murder hornet section to the intro?
Yeah, that sounds fun.
Okay. All right. Murder hornets are like,
or murder
we're down
hornets,
with,
or maybe it'd just be like something from like something weird in the natural world. That sounds fun.
Yeah, or just something
please, no more murder hornets. No murder hornets.
No murder hornets. Maybe it'll be good news, Ben. Maybe I'll also include good news, like penguins photographed hugging each other in Antarctica.
I'm just warning you all. I'm going to drop Kim Jong-un as soon as we know for sure he's alive, because I don't actually believe in joking about the North Koreans.
I hate him. Like,
he's loathsome, and I find North Korea humor pretty offensive. But since we were doing a Boris Johnson death watch, that it turned into a general kind of running commentary on what Boris is up to. It kind of made sense.
I still like the Boris Johnson watch, though. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, no, but Bojo he's good comedy. He and I have one big thing in common, only one, which is that we have both fallen into the Thames. I as a 7-year-old child, and he as the mayor of London.
Is that true? I didn't know.
Yes, it is true. Yeah. I fell into the Thames in Oxford, and I am not ashamed to admit it, however much my hair might be receding. Okay, on that note.
Whatever. Ben, I'm not just saying this because I'm your friend, but I don't think that you're balding. And actually, I think that like every time I've ever seen you, I'm always shocked that like, I'm like, oh, like that is a great shock of gray hair.
I am comfortable with my hair. I'm actually just feigning this for Nicole's amusement. Not that I've ever met.
Can somebody validate me about me not balding? Is that can we have that too?
All right. Thank you, full head of hair, Yascha Mounk, for joining us. Let's do it again. Kate, it's been a pleasure as always. This is like almost day 40.
Are you sick
and
of me yet?
No, I am so like down with keeping on doing this as long as we are in quarantine, people. If you can't have fun in lieu of fun, you can come hang out with us.
Bye, Ben. Bye, Yascha.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.